Okay, welcome to our Eid of Shabbat, our Friday special class version, our Perashat class. And of course, we're in a new Sefer, we're in a new book, we're in Sefer Shemot, we're in Perashat Shemot. Today's question is, what exactly went on in the scene of the burning bush? And I feel, in my humble opinion, that some extent the scene is slightly misunderstood by some and interpreted in perhaps too much of a superficial manner. And I think that there is a beauty and power behind the scenes that we miss out on sometimes by giving that type of, you can say, surface level interpretation. So let's go through the Pesukim. I want to point out to you what I think is some of the common ways of viewing the events of the burning bush, and I'll give you my own contentions and then my take on possibly what instead is really happening. So we know that Moshe Rabbeinu is in the desert, he's a shepherd, sheep are grazing, and then he's by Had HaElohim, the mountain of God. Another question as how he arrived there, and obviously he was privy to something significant about that mountain. Leave that aside. But it says we're in, by the way, Perek Gimal, Pasuk Bet. If you want to follow along, we will not have a screen shared document this morning. Vayera malach Adonai elav b'labat esh mitoch haseneh. And an angel of God appeared to him, b'labat esh, in a flame of fire, as explained by Rashi and others, mitoch haseneh, from within, we'll call it, for lack of a better term, the bush. And of course, as we know, vayar v'hineh haseneh bo'er ba'esh v'haseneh enenu ukal. And he saw that this bush is burning with fire and it is not being consumed, devoured, but not being consumed. So the way that this is commonly seen, I would say, is that, of course, the bush is burning, and you know, it's somewhat of a phenomenon that Moshe Rabbeinu is witnessing right now. Bushes are supposed to be consumed when, or they're supposed to be devoured, let's say, when they're consumed by fire, or vice versa. Next pasuk, V'yomen Moshe asurana ve'eret hamareh hagadol hazeh madua lo yib'ar haseneh. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, asurana, let me, or it's appropriate for me to, lasur means to turn, to deviate, or here just to take a detour. It's not on my trajectory of where I'm currently facing, but let me detour and let me see hamareh hagadol hazeh, this great vision, this great scene, this incredible phenomenon. Why is the bush not burning? So I think typically many take this to be an initiative of Moshe Rabbeinu. And in fact, and I'm not going to say this is not true, but I think some, you hear sometimes in different types of classes, presentations, that this initiative is even meritorious. In other words, because of this initiative, asura na, let me deviate, let me take this detour, then Moshe Rabbeinu merited to see what he saw. And there's something perhaps noble behind this detour that he took. And this mareh hagadol hazeh, what does he want to see? What's the reason that he is going off the path, literally, to try to figure this out? What is he trying to figure out? This hamareh gadol, this incredible scene. Well, I think most just take it to mean that there is something that is scientifically unique going on over here, right? And this is more of a scientific inquiry that Moshe Rabbeinu has. I need to know this, frail wood, branches and twigs bush, when it's on fire, when it's being devoured, it should be consumed. It should burn completely, and it's not. It's a mystery. It's a phenomenon. I need to find out what's going on. A scientific inquiry. And then the last pasuk that we'll look at, Vayar Adonai kisal l'od, God saw him. Well, he's coming. He is taking the detour. Vayikra Elohim elav Elohim mitoch haseneh v'yomed Moshe Moshe v'yomed Hineni. Of course, God says the famous words. He says his name twice. He calls him in the more famous response, Hineni. another great discussion for another time. And I think this is commonly understood to be Hashem, so to speak, realizing that Moshe Rabbeinu got curious, and then perhaps that warranted and that opened the door for this prophecy and this first communication, seemingly, of Moshe, of God to Moshe Rabbeinu. So I want to tell you what my contentions humbly would be with this approach. First of all, the fact that we assume that the soneh is bo'er ba'esh, the seneh rather, the bush is bo'er, it means that the bush is on fire. And we're wondering why the fire is not consuming it. But if you look at the words carefully, Rabbi Hirsch points this out, and I will get back at the end of the class to Rabbi Hirsch. But it says the angel of God appeared to him, belabat esh, in the flame of fire. In other words, the angel was in the fire. Mitoch haseneh, and the fire, or the vision of it, was within the bush. Now, how does that look? I can't describe it to you. But that is not exactly saying that the bush is on fire. It says the angel is consumed by fire, or being devoured by fire, and that's located inside, in the interior of the bush. That doesn't mean that the bush is being overwhelmed by fire. Not necessarily so. Okay. Now, this idea that Moshe Rabbeinu is doing something meritorious, he's taking a detour, and he said, Asura na er'eh, let me see. Well, the first problem with that is that in the previous pasuk already says, Vayad, and he saw. So his eyes are already affixed on this bush, and he's wondering about it. So Asura na ver'eh, let me go see, I'm turning towards it, is really not necessary. If he's just astounded by the way this looks, its appearance, or is he trying to get a better look? I have a problem with explaining it that way. And what's hamareh hagadol hazeh? I mean, really, how noble is it that Moshe has a scientific inquiry? Now, of course, we're encouraged to study God's world in all its realms, chemically, biologically, ecologically. I mean, we really need to get to know Hashem by knowing his creations and the way his natural order works. But I don't know if in this context, in this pivotal moment of history, when God is going to interview, so to speak, his greatest prophet ever, and the Jews are in servitude and they need salvation, that it's significant enough to mention that Moshe Rabbeinu has a scientific question. I don't know if that should be the case. And then finally, this idea that Hashem said, Sar l'ot. Oh, look, he's interested. Hey guys, he's coming, right? And I'm trying not to make light of it, but it's almost as if to say, well, God's hiding behind the bush, right? Surprise, this is your first prophecy. I don't know if there is really importance enough in the way that scene is described for the Torah to even make mention of it. The fact that he's curious and Hashem based on that, is that prophecy really based on his interest and curiosity? Meaning this, if Moshe Rabbeinu saw the bush, wondered about it, and kept walking and didn't actually take a road detour towards it, does that mean this prophecy wouldn't happen? Does that mean Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't be chosen as a prophet? I don't think so. I rather humbly would like to try to explain this story in a different light. And I first want to say, and this is not a theory, this is really a proof that beyond the shadow of a doubt, Moshe Rabbeinu was already a chosen prophet. He was chosen to be a prophet before this scene, and before he saw the sight of the bush, and before he turned towards it. How do we know this? Well, the Rambam, in his laws of Yesodei Torah, talking about qualifications of prophets, we know, and this is based on Hakamim, different sources, that there is certain criterion by which God would choose a prophet. A person who's going to prophesy has to already have some standards in place, some accomplishments behind him. It has to be a person who has mastery over Torah and all realms of knowledge. It has to be a person who is so disciplined, who has worked on it and honed his character traits to the extent that he appears almost flawless, which is not exactly that, but relative to other people, and is a person that has conquered to almost a complete extent his material desires, to the extent that his single thrust, his draw, what moves him is to serve God only. It's a person that has, to a great extent, separated himself from the material existence of this world. That's the way our prophets were. This person, and by the way, the Rambam says that it's already known by others what type of person this is. Whether or not he's humbly sitting at home, he is known to be of great significance and stature. It is not a matter of if this person will prophesy, just when he will begin. And so Moshe was already a qualified prophet who was already identified by HaKadosh Baruch Hu as earning the right to be so. And it was only a matter of when his career of prophesying and his communication with God would begin. And so in that light, you can really begin to look at these Pesukim a little differently. And you can say that when it says, Vayar v'hineh seneh, he saw, and here is this great sight of this burnt, so to speak, burning bush, as the case in other sources in Torah and Tanakh, Vayar doesn't always simply mean saw. It also can mean, and I believe here does mean, to understand. He understood. This is it. The time has come. I am getting the call. Vayar, he understood because of this really amazing looking scene. He's looking at this angel within a flame, within a bush. Before figuring it out precisely, he understood that this is my time. I'm getting the call from God. And based on that, the subsequent pasuk, Asura na ver'eh, let me turn and see, was not necessarily a curiosity about a physical phenomenon and an interest just based on the physical and chemical incredible sight that he's seeing right now. Rather, it was more of a intellectual inquiry. Asura na. I need to turn, I need to think, I need to focus. I need to figure this out because there's a presentation right now put before me by God, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Obviously, this Mar'eh HaGadol Hazeh, this awesome scene is a message that is now being conveyed to me. Asura na, it's incumbent upon me to figure this out because I am right now being called upon. And I'll tell you that there is a great source for this approach, and that is the Midrash Shir HaShirim Rabbah. Shemot Rabbah. And in the Midrash, it gives us a number of possible different options as to what the symbolism is of the ash, the fire, and the seneh, the bush, and what Moshe Rabbeinu was looking at and being really befuddled about. And I believe behind each one of them is this puzzling philosophical question that Moshe Rabbeinu had. Not a scientific inquiry, but a philosophical inquiry. I'll give you 3 examples. There are numerous ones in the Midrash. Example number 1, the Midrash says that the mashal, the example of the seneh, of the bush, it represents the most lowly of trees. It's not grand, it's not high in stature. And the nimshal, the analogy is to Am Yisrael, who this lowly of nations right now, subservient to the Egyptians, disgraced, just being stomped upon by another people. And the ash in that context is the Egyptians, is Mitzrayim, is the devouring force, oppressing this poor nation. But the nation is not being completely consumed. And thus the philosophical question of Moshe Rabbeinu, how is it that this frail, overpowered, disadvantageous nation is surviving? And perhaps a historical view by Moshe Rabbeinu, how do we survive? How do we do it? How can we, downtrodden and oppressed over many, many generations and centuries by different countries, how do we manage to survive? Example one in question, inquiry one of Moshe Rabbeinu. The next, the Midrash says that the seneh could also represent the toughest of trees. Its branch being very tough, hard to snap and crack. Perhaps it was a certain type of bush. And that is Mitzrayim. And that, in this analogy, the bush stands for the Egyptians, a tough, oppressive, enslaving nation for whatever the poor slaves that are under the servitude of this nation. It is absolute torture. And the ash in that light, according to the Midrash, could then be the potential destruction of this nation, of this sineh, of this bush. And the question of Moshe Rabbeinu is, Madua lo yiva'ad hasineh? Why aren't, or maybe you, Hashem, why aren't they be devoured? Why aren't you destroying them? They're perpetrating such evil. Why aren't you wiping out the evil, HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Philosophical question by Moshe Rabbeinu, number two. Why do you allow the continuity of such evil and oppressive people to survive and continue on this earth? And then also, in the futuristic view, I see all these horrible regimes and empires, and they're torturous and oppressive to poor, downtrodden other peoples, other ethnic peoples and peoples of color and race, etc., and of socioeconomic status. Why do you allow them to continue to oppress? Moshe Rabbeinu, Madua, he's inquiring. And then finally, not finally, but another one that I'll give you an example from the Midrash is that the seneh is very thorny. This bush produces thorns, but it also produces roses. A rose bush, if you ever saw, is very rough, a lot of thorns on it. But in the middle, there are roses. And the Midrash says that Bnei Israel, that represents Am Yisrael. The fact that we have amongst us Sadiqim, the righteous, the roses, and the Sha'im, the evil, the thorns, and everything in between. And perhaps, based on that analogy, the philosophical question of Moshe Rabbeinu was, wow, this nation, how do they get by? They're so diverse and multifaceted in a positive and a negative manner. I mean, I really understand, first of all, how they survive and how doesn't the evil amongst them cause their destruction? How do they reconcile all this? How does the righteous deal with the evil? And how eventually can we be unified based on the fact that you have to deal with such people amongst the nation? Moshe, again, was looking towards the future and looking at Am Yisrael and through all types of assimilation and how we will fall, the waxing and waning of our nation. We're going to be diverse within. And how will we get through all of that? Yet unanswered question throughout the ages. All this was part of Moshe Rabbeinu's Asura Na'avireh. Let me go, let me contemplate, let me try to find out. I'm inquiring right now. Critical questions. Hamareh Hagadol Hazeh. These great philosophical issues. Why isn't the evil wiped out? How is it that Am Yisrael survives? And how do we get by with such a difficult mix amongst our diverse nation? But I think with all that, there's one other beautiful message that the seneh leaves us. And I told you I would get back to Rabbi Hirsch, the famous commentator, of course, on Chumash, Rabbi Raphael Simson Hirsch. And Rabbi Hirsch explains that as with Matan Torah, we see that when God announces himself, so to speak, on this earth, he often takes the form of fire. It's said by Matan Torah, by the giving of Torah on Mount Sinai, that Mar'eh Kevod Adonai, the vision of the honor of God, Ke'esh Ochelet Berosh Hahar. It was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain. So similarly described to the bush scene. And why is that? That's because the Torah Kedosha is also described as fire. At the end of the Torah, of course, in Perashat Ta'azinu, where Moshe Rabbeinu describes in a poetic manner us receiving Torah, and he identifies Torah as Esh Dat Lamor. God gave to them a fiery law. And that is a profound description of Torah. There's so much literature and so much conversation about what that term means. But you just look at the compound word, esh and dat, fire and law, where the Torah is indeed an incredibly scholarly work. It's a legal document. It's one that takes great intellect and intellectual toil and scholarly pursuit to master it. On the other hand, you can find lahavdil, other works of Gentiles and other nations that are also scholarly. But of course, our Torah is divine. Esh, that appeared on Har Sinai, represented God, is the source of the Torah, the divine fire. And that was what makes this incredibly scholarly work so unique, so perfect, so all-encompassing. And in that esh is also an implication, and this is not the words of Rabbi Herz, this is my take, is inspiration, is emotion, is living and breathing this Torah. It's not just a dry, legal, scholarly manuscript. It lives. And as Rabbi Herz says, like the fire, Torah penetrates. Like fire, Torah refines. Like fire, Torah enlightens. An incredible analogy of Torah. And that mixture of esh and dat, of inspiration and emotion and awakening and scholarship and intellectual pursuit, that synthesis is our Torah Kedoshah. Moshe Rabbeinu, you will be the first prophet. Know, be inspired and anticipate this great day where I will give to you on this very mountain that incredible gift to mankind, but specifically to Am Yisrael. You will be the conduit to that gift. I'm so glad that you stopped by this bush to think about that gift. And as to your philosophical questions, they're very dear and precious. Hold on to them. We have reason to believe that Moshe Rabbeinu used this moment as his frame of reference for the rest of his prophetic career, always referring back to that great moment, his debut as a prophet, where he saw that burning bush and he asked himself these questions, always refining his answers and further developing his understanding of good and evil, of Am Yisrael's purpose on this earth, of the miracle of our survival, looking towards the future and inspiring and teaching his children for generations to come what he learned at the great scene of the burning bush. Shabbat Shalom.